The Bible clearly defines true worship as something offered only to God. He alone is worthy of our adoration, reverence, and praise. Our worship should be a reflection of our love for Him, flowing from hearts filled with gratitude and awe. Anything that diverts our focus from God or diminishes the centrality of His glory in our worship becomes a dangerous substitute, a potential idol that can lead us astray. Exodus 20:3-5. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. Observation. The commandment explicitly forbids the creation and worship of images representing heavenly, earthly, or aquatic entities. Despite this, many modern churches display statues of Jesus, Mary, and various saints. These figures often become focal points of devotion, with congregants lighting candles, kneeling, or praying before them. While these acts are intended to honor the biblical God or invoke intercession, they raise questions about alignment with this directive. Does substituting pagan idols with Christian figures fundamentally change the nature of the act? If the essence of idolatry is misplaced reverence, how do these practices differ? This raises a broader theological dilemma, whether veneration of these images inadvertently contradicts the biblical God's command. The Bible book challenges believers to evaluate whether their acts of worship reflect devotion to the Creator or misplaced reverence for created objects. Churches must reconsider if such practices enrich spiritual lives or dilute the purity of faith by resembling the idolatry condemned in this passage. Leviticus 26:1. Do not make idols or set up an image or a sacred stone for yourselves, and do not place a carved stone in your land to bow down before it. I am the Lord your God. Reflection. This verse underscores a strict prohibition against crafting or venerating physical objects in worship. Yet many contemporary altars are adorned with elaborate carvings, sacred stones, and ornate crosses. These objects, while intended to honor the biblical God, frequently attract acts of veneration, such as kneeling or touching. This prompts the question, are these symbols merely tools to focus worship, or do they risk becoming idols themselves? In striving to visually represent faith, do modern practices inadvertently contravene the spirit of this command? The biblical God's intention seems clear. Worship must be directed solely to Him, free from reliance on tangible intermediaries. By evaluating whether these objects inspire faith or distract from the essence of worship, believers can determine if they have unknowingly allowed idolatrous tendencies to infiltrate their faith practices. This reflection challenges religious institutions to align their traditions with the core teachings of the Bible book, Deuteronomy 4:16-19. So that you do not become corrupt and make for yourselves an idol, an image of any shape, whether formed like a man or a woman, or like any animal on earth or any bird that flies in the air. Question. Religious artwork often depicts angels, saints, and even animals in ways meant to inspire devotion. While these representations can be spiritually uplifting, do they risk encouraging the corruption warned about in this verse? Consider how these images often provoke acts of reverence, such as kneeling, touching, or offering prayers. Are such actions mere expressions of faith, or do they blur the line between veneration and idolatry? The biblical God's warning implies that even well-intentioned practices can lead to spiritual corruption if they redirect focus from Him to physical representations. If these images are truly harmless, why do they evoke such strong emotional responses and acts of devotion? By examining whether these depictions align with the biblical mandate or encourage idolatrous tendencies, believers can better assess their faith practices. This verse challenges the modern church to prioritize spiritual worship over reliance on physical representations. Deuteronomy 5:8-9. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. Challenge. Crucifixes, religious icons, and statues are central elements in many Christian traditions. These objects are often treated with great reverence, with believers bowing, praying, and even attributing miracles to them. This verse explicitly forbids such practices, prompting the question, how do these actions differ from the idolatry condemned here? Some argue that these symbols merely serve as reminders of faith, not objects of worship. However, the physical acts of kneeling and praying before these objects closely resemble the behaviors described as idolatrous in the Bible book. Are these traditions rooted in genuine faith, or are they reinterpretations of ancient practices to suit human preferences? This challenge invites believers to critically examine their worship practices, ensuring they align with the biblical God's directives rather than human traditions that risk veering into idolatry. Deuteronomy 27:15. Cursed is anyone who makes an idol, a thing detestable to the Lord, the work of skilled hands, and sets it up in secret. Perspective. This verse issues a stern warning against the creation and veneration of idols, emphasizing their detestable nature to the biblical God. Yet many churches prominently display ornate statues, sacred relics, and other crafted objects as expressions of devotion. These items, often celebrated as works of art, may inadvertently become objects of worship. If the biblical God detests these creations, why are they so widely embraced and even celebrated within religious settings? This contradiction raises questions about whether such objects genuinely reflect faith or betray its essence. Are these items tools for connecting with the divine, or do they obscure the purity of worship by shifting focus to human creations? The challenge lies in discerning whether these practices enhance or dilute true devotion, prompting believers to align their worship with the biblical God's commands. Isaiah 42:8, I am the Lord, that is my name, I will not yield my glory to another or my praise to idols. Insight. Worship practices often shift focus from the biblical God to objects or figures such as revered statues, church leaders, or religious icons. This verse emphasizes that the biblical God's glory and praise are exclusive and must not be redirected. The question arises whether such practices dilute the essence of true worship by prioritizing creations over the Creator. Historically, religious institutions have justified the use of icons and statues as tools for devotion, yet the line between veneration and idolatry remains blurred. When people kneel before statues or direct prayers to saints, is it an act of faith or a subtle form of idolatry? The verse challenges modern believers to reevaluate their worship and ensure that the glory rightfully due to the biblical God is not compromised by human traditions or reinterpretations. If religious practices today are causing believers to focus on symbols rather than the spiritual connection with the Creator, it raises a critical need to realign with the essence of true worship as outlined in the Bible book, Isaiah 44:9-20. All who make idols are nothing, and the things they treasure are worthless. Those who would speak up for them are blind, they are ignorant to their own shame. Thoughts. This passage harshly critiques the creation and veneration of idols, calling them worthless and shameful. Despite this, many religious institutions display expensive artifacts and treasures such as statues, ornate relics, and lavish decorations. These items are often justified as symbols of faith, but they sometimes draw attention away from the divine and towards material grandeur. Could these treasures be modern blind spots, contradicting the biblical God's explicit condemnation of idolatry? The passage reminds believers that no matter how elaborate or costly these artifacts are, they hold no power or value compared to the Creator. Churches that treasure such items risk turning their focus from spiritual purity to material excess, echoing the very practices condemned in the Bible book. This passage challenges believers to critically examine their faith practices and to consider whether they truly honor the biblical God or inadvertently uphold traditions that detract from true worship. Jeremiah 10:3-5. For the practices of the peoples are worthless. They cut a tree out of the forest, and a craftsman shapes it with his chisel. They adorn it with silver and gold. They fasten it with hammer and nails, so it will not totter. Commentary. Modern traditions such as Christmas trees and nativity scenes can trace their origins to pagan practices, yet they have become central to Christian celebrations. These customs are often adorned with extravagant decorations and surrounded by festive rituals. While many argue that these traditions are harmless or symbolic, the passage raises questions about whether they echo the very practices condemned in the Bible book. Have these customs evolved into a form of idolatry, or are they merely cultural expressions of faith? The passage critiques the reliance on man-made objects for spiritual significance, urging believers to distinguish between genuine worship and cultural adaptations that might stray from the original teachings. It also challenges Christians to consider whether such practices align with the biblical God's commands or serve as distractions that compromise the purity of worship. Habakkuk 2:18. Of what value is an idol carved by a craftsman, or an image that teaches lies? For the one who makes it trusts in his own creation. He makes idols that cannot speak. Consideration: the prominence of relics, statues, and images in many churches raises questions about misplaced trust and faith. These objects are often revered as possessing miraculous powers or serving as conduits for divine intervention. Yet, Habakkuk's warning underscores the futility of relying on lifeless, human-made creations. Do these practices shift trust from the biblical God to objects that cannot see, hear, or speak? While some argue that these relics inspire faith, others see them as contradictions to the essence of true worship. This verse challenges believers to critically assess their reliance on physical objects in their spiritual practices. Are these items tools for deepening faith, or do they risk becoming substitutes for genuine trust in the Creator? The reflection invites a re-evaluation of traditions that may prioritize the tangible over the spiritual. Acts 17:29. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. Examination. Despite this clear admonition, churches worldwide are adorned with gold and silver decorations, ornate crosses, and intricate statues. These items are often explained as symbols of God's majesty and glory. Yet this verse warns against equating the divine with material objects crafted by human hands. Does this contradiction reveal misplaced priorities in worship? Instead of focusing on the spiritual connection with the biblical God, do such practices elevate material representations? The verse calls for a deeper understanding of what it means to be God's offspring, emphasizing spiritual, not material connections. Churches must consider whether their elaborate decorations serve to inspire faith or inadvertently lead believers into subtle forms of idolatry. Romans 1:22-23. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being and birds and animals and reptiles. Evaluation. Statues and images of saints and angels are widespread in churches and are often celebrated as acts of faith. However, this verse critiques the exchange of the biblical God's immortal glory for mortal representations. Are these depictions wise tools for worship, or do they risk becoming foolish distractions? While they may inspire believers, there is a fine line between reverence and idolatry. This verse challenges churches and individuals to examine their practices critically, ensuring that the glory of the biblical God is not compromised by an overemphasis on human-made images. It invites believers to reflect on whether their actions uphold the biblical God's teachings or veer towards traditions that dilute true worship. 1 Corinthians 10:14, therefore, my dear friends, flee from idolatry. Reflection. The concept of idolatry has evolved, encompassing not just physical statues, but also subtle forms like celebrity pastors, traditions, and material wealth. This verse serves as a stark warning to avoid all forms of idolatry, urging believers to stay vigilant. Modern idolatry can be deceptive, as it often masquerades as faithfulness or devotion. How can believers discern and flee from these hidden forms of idolatry? The verse emphasizes the need for constant self-examination and alignment with the teachings of the Bible book. By prioritizing the biblical God above all else, believers can navigate the complexities of modern faith practices and avoid the pitfalls of idolatry. 1 John 5:21. Dear children, keep yourselves from idols. Warning, idolatry today is not limited to physical objects. It extends to rituals, leaders, ideologies, and even material success. This verse urges believers to remain vigilant and guard their hearts against anything that could replace the biblical God's rightful place. Are modern idols less harmful than the ones explicitly condemned in the Bible book? This warning calls for introspection and a commitment to maintaining a pure, undistracted focus on the Creator. By identifying and avoiding these modern forms of idolatry, believers can ensure their worship remains true to the essence of the biblical God's teaching. Revelation 9:20. The rest of mankind did not stop worshipping demons and idols of gold, silver, bronze, stone, and wood, idols that cannot see or hear or